Hello everybody, my name is Angus Phillips and I'm Director of the Oxford International Centre for Publishing. Today I'm in conversation with Dan Bunyard, who is Publishing Director and Head of Non-Fiction Publishing at Michael Joseph, which is a division of Penguin Random House. So firstly, Dan, many thanks for talking to me today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for asking me.
And perhaps we could just start by, could I ask you to describe your role at Michael Joseph?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been there for a bit over 10 years now, and I run the non-fiction team. MJ is a division of Penguin that goes back a long way and has always had what you could describe as a commercial focus, insofar as we're aiming for big readerships, generalist audiences, and a key criteria for me and for the team, for fiction as well as non-fiction, that we look for is about how many copies we'll be looking to sell. You compare that with other parts of Penguin or other publishing companies. The criteria might be quite different. It might be, is this book going to win a prize? I'd love it if books that I publish do win prizes, but it's more about, can we reach a big audience and create bestsellers out of it?
And what have been the highlights of your publishing program over the last few years?
Well, one of the big hits we had a few years ago was a series of parody books involving the Ladybird brands, which were huge. We sold millions of copies of those. That really hit a nerve. I published a couple of books with GCHQ, some puzzle books, which was a very interesting, quite challenging experience. We've published Stephen Fry's fiction and non-fiction for quite some time. There's quite a lot of celebrity-led stuff that we do. For me, I think very satisfying when you take a book by an unknown author, but it still reaches a really large audience because of the elements to it that just really hit a spot. And perhaps a good example of that is a book called The Salt Path by Raina Wynn, which has been a prize-winning, huge success for us.
Yeah, and I think.
Sorry, I should also just mention, because it's a really big one, is Mrs. Hinch, which I think is quite a well-known one. An Instagram cleaning sensation. We've sold a staggering number of copies of her books, and they're doing very well under lockdown.
And you're one of the very few people in the publishing industry to have downloaded the complete set of sales data for books in the UK over what period?
Well, as far back as you can go. I mean, I do feel I'm probably quite odd, probably in many ways, but certainly in the respect that I've have done that. And I've always been fascinated by what BookScan can show us and reveal about trends and buying patterns. But a few years ago, I think 4 or 5 years ago now, I decided that I really wanted to take it very seriously and do a really big, deep dive into it. Now, for people who are familiar with BookScan, they might know that normally the reports that it generates will yield around 5,000 records. So if you want to look at the full range of non-fiction history from BookScan, 5,000 records will only get you down as far as books that sell about, I think probably if you did it right now, about 37,000 copies. So anything that sold fewer than 5,000 copies or so isn't going to get picked up. If you want to drill down to books that have only sold one copy, which is in itself quite a fun and edifying activity, you have to do a lot of combined searches. It's a long process, which, as I say, is probably not something everyone would want to do. But what it does is generate closer to 400,000 records. What you can then do is start looking back and finding books from the 1900s right through the 20th century, and of course you can do it for fiction as well, as I have done, and it's an approach you can do outside the UK. The reason I did that is because it struck me that to really start analysing sales patterns in a big way, you can't just stop at 5,000 records. You really need to go a bit deeper than that.
And so you were kind of on the hunt for trends, and could you find some patterns in that data?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's all sorts of things that you can learn from an approach like that. And I think the three things that I would pick out as being really important would be, and ways to look at this kind of data, I think, are ascertaining what the peak historical volume is for an area, because that's something which varies enormously. Looking at the combined volume for an area, again, that tells you something potentially quite different. Because if you looked alone at the peak historical volume, you might see a book that sells 1.2 million copies and think, well, that's a huge area. But it's only by looking at the broader area, how many copies within that area have been sold over the last 10, 20 years relatively to another area. Do you get more of a sense of how big a motivation it is within the market? So peak historical volume, combined volume, and I think the other one which I think is really key is looking at the frequency with which books in an area or responding to a particular motivation will sell over a particular volume. Now, you might say, how often do books in this area sell over 100,000 copies, or how often do they sell over 10,000 copies? That's a particularly useful exercise to do, because where that's helped me is to identify cycles. Because if you see quite rapidly that a certain area generates a book that will sell at X volume, but only every 5 to 10 years, then you can start seeing those kind of cyclical patterns which emerge. It's much harder to do if you've got an area where there's consistently a very high volume year on year.
So this has kind of set you off on the track of looking at motivations and the book market. And firstly, I want to ask you, because you want to make a distinction between the experienced value and the expectancy value of a book. So how does that work?
Well, this is a distinction that I felt was useful to draw because it enables you to start looking at books in the abstract or as sort of propositions, and to start picking apart the elements which make them in the abstract before someone has actually read it. Because our purchasers, we may sort of use the Amazon look inside function, but basically we haven't experienced a book when we bought it, when we buy it. It is based on our expectation of it and the value that holds for us. Now, one thing to say there is that my experienced value, once I've read it, might feed back into your expectancy value. So if I tell you, well, this book is terrible or this book is very good, that may raise or lower your expectancy value. And there is a feedback loop which happens there. And over time, you see word of mouth kick in when experienced value is consistently higher than expectancy value. Just keeps on pushing that expectancy value up. Information cascades around books and any form of media happen faster and more widely than ever before. But the way in which that works is something which has always been around. And I found it fascinating to see that in the early 1900s in the American market, there was this period where publishers had this habit of what they called booming books, where they would market books that were coming out from them with ridiculously sort of hyperbolic terms, the best book you will read this year. And for several years, this went on and got so excessive that the audience became very cynical towards it. And in very obvious terms, what happened was that as they pushed up the expectancy value, the experience value, as people actually read these books, was consistently lower, and hence the cynicism setting in. So, but to go back to the question, why make the distinction? It's because, as I say, books are bought based on expectancy value, and content can sometimes often be not necessarily relevant to that, but not part of what makes someone buy the book. I think that's a crucial thing to understand.
Okay, so that leads me on. I mean, but this has led you to reflect on our motivations for buying a book. So, what are your thoughts around? How does it work with motivation and book purchasing?
Well, Exactly, yes, because I think that sometimes the mere purchase of a book prior to us reading it can satisfy our motivations. Now, the way I look at this is that you can look at broad human motivations, and you can look at specific book buying motivations. Now, just to take the second of those two, obviously there is an infinite range of motivations. You can have a book on anything. You cannot create a taxonomy of an infinite array of things. So you have to start narrowing it down. And some qualitative research that we did as a company a few years ago helped me come to the conclusion that there were what you could refine down to 3 core book buying motivations, which I think are absolutely critical. And I would describe them as a hedonic motivation, a utilitarian motivation, and a self-identificatory motivation. And just very briefly to talk about what I mean by that,
Yeah.
I will buy a book because of the way it makes me feel, because of the experience that I'm paying for. It might make me cry, it might make me laugh. It's going to make me feel a certain way, and I place a value in that experience. It may be down to the quality of the writing. So a huge array of things that might apply to. The utilitarian motivation. Now, in some senses, that's very obvious. I might buy a book on growing vegetables because I want to get a practical knowledge about how to grow vegetables. Certainly right now. But it can also apply to fiction. We use fiction as a way to enhance our theory of mind. We use it to help us navigate vicariously through challenging moments in our lives and social situations. I'd love to come back to that in relation to what people have been reading in terms of fiction during lockdown, actually. And then thirdly, this self-identificatory thing. Now, I would pull gifting under self-identification as a motivation, simply because when I buy a book for you, I'm hoping it reflects back on me as the kind of person that I am, that I know you well enough to pick you something that you actually like. So although gifting is a motivation, I feel that it falls under my act of self-identification through buying a book. But broadly, I think this is a massive and often underappreciated motivation for book sales. I might buy a book, a diet book, and my mere act of buying it makes me feel a couple of pounds lighter. I might buy Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time and immediately feel smarter, even if I never make it past page 5, which I've got to admit I don't think I did. I might buy a book by Alex Ferguson on leadership and like to think I'm slightly closer to being a great leader. So it's a very important aspect of why we buy books. They're not just for our shelves. They are for how we imagine ourselves to be and how we like to think of ourselves. So those are 3 really key motivations that I think once you start being aware of, you can see operating in the market in all sorts of interesting ways, often in conflict with one another. You often get a hedonic motivation liberating a utilitarian motivation. An example I'd use of this is Sophie's World. The entire history of Western philosophy is a daunting prospect for reading, just as a 1,000-page textbook might be. But if you present it as a novel involving a likable 12-year-old girl called Sophie, almost a sort of detective story, then you massively boost this hedonic appeal and value to it. I'm going to read a nice novel here. I like novels. And in the process, all of a sudden, this door is unlocked. I'm going to, inject into myself the entire history of Western philosophy. Great. It's, and I think that approach is something which fascinates me, because you see it in other areas like, Freakonomics, perhaps, again, a daunting, difficult, potentially dry subject area made hedonically appealing because it deals with stories, narratives, microeconomics. So that the way they work together is important to bear in mind. I talked about the broader human motivations that are common to us all and lie underneath book motivations. And what I've used personally in the research that I've been doing is something called self-determination theory, which, for those who are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's some similarities there, but it's a 21st century approach, I suppose you could describe it as. It's based on a huge body of empirical research. Now, very simply, it separates motivations out into two camps. You have deficit needs, which are the kind of needs like hunger, thirst, rest, sex, but also psychological ones like self-esteem and certainty, calm, which until we've satisfied them, preoccupy us. But once they're satisfied, once that deficit has been dealt with, we're not so fussed about them. They sit alongside what they describe as growth needs, and there are three of these: competence, autonomy, and relatedness. And the point here is that we can never have enough of them. We always want more. You can always feel slightly more competent, connected, and autonomous. Now, I found this is a tremendously useful model to try and lay underneath book buying motivations, because my belief is that these motivations are tapped into and exploited in a way that correlates very directly with book sales. When a book sells in a huge volume, it's often not just because there's a positive hedonic angle to it, a positive utilitarian or self-identification angle to it. It's because the reader will feel a stronger sense of autonomy, competence, and relatedness by engaging with it. So just to take an example of, colouring in books, I think, is a good example here, because there was a period where you could say there was a depleted deficit need for rest, for calm that people felt. That creates this itching, gnawing need that's got to be satisfied. And books often work, I believe, by offering antidotes to needs, to problems. And in that environment, you're looking for something that's going to satisfy that need. So that sort of sets the engine going. Now, if you think about a colouring in book, it offers the opportunity for autonomy in a very obvious sense, because I can use whatever pencils or pens I want to use and colour it in the way I want to use it. I can immediately feel competent, because when I look back and see, wow, it looks quite attractive, it offers me a chance also for relatedness. And I think that comes in a couple of ways. One of the things that was so interesting about that massive boom we saw in colouring in books a few years ago was people sharing them online, and almost a community sense to it. It is sort of encouragement of one another. That's a beautiful bit of colouring in you've done there. And I think that was perhaps key to it working. Another thing as well is when something becomes huge in that way, I think there's a raised relatedness value to it. If a book has sold a huge number of copies, if there's a genuine sort of boom going on in an area, that raises our expectancy around the relatedness value that it has. So that, all of those things I think came to play with colouring in books as an example.
So can you assign particular motivations to particular types of book, or is that too simplistic?
No, not at all. And I think it is something you can do. I mean, in an obvious way, think about how we all need to eat. Cookery, is an obvious thing that taps into our frequently depleted need for food, but also we exercise autonomy by choosing the type of cookery book that we want to engage with. We learn skills. I think it's an interesting thing to note that within cookery book sales, by far and away the biggest subsection of that is books that teach you how to cook quickly and simply, easy cookery, because immediately you're fast tracking someone's sense of competence. I buy this book, I'm going to feel competent at cooking. But if you take again that example of people needing having a motivation for feeling calm, it's not enough to just look at one area like self-development. Again, the colouring in book example, that does not fit into the same out of the 150 or so categories of non-fiction that Nielsen offers you, as does a book like The Little Book of Hugo. So if you're trying to identify patterns which relate to broad macro motivations, you cannot stop at genres. Genres, you could say, are arbitrary abstractions that we place over the top of the book sales that we see. But if you want to understand the motivations underneath and see the patterns fully, you have to look holistically across the picture. So another example which I often think about is the books which you could argue promise the reader that they will lose weight. You might find that in health food cookery, you might find it in fitness and diet, but you might find it in other areas as well. And to take, to go back to what we were saying earlier on about peak historical volume and combined volume, this is immediately very interesting to me, because if you take the combined volume of the top 10 best-selling books that promise to the reader one way or the other, and they're not all in the same genre, that you will lose weight by buying the book, you end up with a combined volume just from those top 10 books of 7.5 million units, which is huge. Now, a while ago, I published a book where the promise was to the reader that you will live a longer life. And as part of the conversations I had with the author on this particular book, I talked about this with him. Rather alarmingly, I found that if you take the top 10, the combined volume of the top 10 best-selling books that offer the reader a promise that they will live a longer life, the volume is not the same. It's only, last time I checked, 121,000 units. I used this example as a way, and I'll have to admit rather cynically and perhaps a bit meanly, to suggest to him that we might want to emphasize the weight loss aspects to his book as opposed to the live longer aspects of the book. But I find that fascinating. You ask anyone on the street, so, well, what matters to you most? Do you want to live a long, healthy life, or do you want to lose weight? What they tell you probably won't concord with what a huge body of sales information tells you. In terms of book sales, the motivation to lose weight and perhaps satisfy that depleted self-esteem need, which might be driving it, is enormous compared to the motivation as shown through book sales to live a long, healthy life, which is, as you might find it.
No, it's fascinating. And you've sort of developed, through the analysis, you've seen kind of peak cycles around particular categories of books. So, for example, like around words or grammar or spelling and things like that, that sort of type of language book, you reckon there's a kind of cycle to that kind of publishing? Yeah,
definitely. Again, this is it's something that I feel that as an industry, we often talk about cycles. Anyone who's been around in the industry for quite a long time will it's almost a folklore sort of belief that there are cycles in publishing and that it will come around. And I think that if you take this sort of big data historical view, you immediately start seeing it's actually true. Certain areas will see, sometimes every 5 to 10 years, sometimes every 2 years, sometimes every 20 years, books that sell far better than books in the intervening years. And one of the things that I've tried to do in my publishing is to identify what I think of as dormant volcanoes, and these are those areas where that every once in a while there'll be a big book, but you also know that it's been X number of years since the last explosion. So when I published the first GCHQ puzzle book, it had been something like 10 years since the big Sudoku explosion. Now, prior to that, I think you can find evidence every 5 to 10 years you would get a big sort of puzzle quiz book. It had been quite a long time since there was anything like that in the market. The reason why I think this works is not because I think there's some kind of, big celestial wheel turning round, in a tidal way. It's not because of that. It's because, and it comes back to that expectancy value thing, I think. It's about how I believe books really sell on the basis of our assumption that they carry novelty and quality. I want to know that for me, this book is new. I don't already have it. If it's going to have value to me, it has to be something I don't already have. And the quality is, it has to be something that is worth me having. Now, novelty, therefore, is critical to book sales. Certain areas allow for a far greater degree. They've got far greater tolerance for novelty than other areas. So you think about memoir. The reason why it's one of the biggest areas of the market, I would argue, is that there's an inherent capacity for novelty everywhere you look, because everyone writing their memoir is different from someone else writing their memoir. Grammar books are not the same. There's only so many ways that you can present a grammar book and make it feel genuinely novel. So as an area, it doesn't allow for so much variation and tolerance for sales. And, you've got, the example I gave of Mrs. Hinch earlier. One of the reasons that I was so keen that we went for that as a book, there's all sorts of reasons. We were very, very keen as a team, but I was conscious that if you look at books on cleaning and tidying your home, you can see evidence there's a 5 to 10 year cycle there, and it had been 5 years since the last one. Something else just to add on to that is that, or two things. Firstly, I think you sometimes see a strong contextual motivation, a need for something combined with a cycle. And I think that's something which happened again with the Hinch. And the reason I think that is because I think in a period, as we were saying, where people are feeling perhaps in need of something that helps them feel calm, offering them a way to feel in control of their domestic sphere and achieve calm through that, especially when you feel completely out of control of the bigger picture, is a way to satisfy a contextual need. If that's combined with a cycle as well, then I think that's something which you expect will work very well. Just the last thing to say on that, which I think has been one of the key things that I've picked up from doing this research, is the way in which successive iterations of books, in the sense of the kind of the propositions that they offer, every time one sees a doubling of the iteration, you see a halving of the value, pretty much. It's normally between 35 to 45%. So in other words, whatever book it might be a diet book, or a puzzle book, what you often see is that the first iteration achieves a certain volume. The second, if ostensibly it carries the same elements and is satisfying the same motivation, will sell almost incredibly reliably about 40% of the preceding volume. And then the third one will again sell about 40% of that volume. It's such a startlingly ubiquitous phenomenon that I rather grandly call it a universal ratio in the paper that you're very kindly publishing, because it does feel to me like it is exactly that. It's a very strange, very real phenomenon that if you repeat something that's pretty much the same, you get a halving of the sales. And I think what you're seeing is a halving of the novelty, you put it that way. So, and an interesting way, aspect of that is that whatever that first volume is, say Joe Wick's first book sells 1.2 million, the second book sells say 600 or whatever, and so on. The same applies to a book that might sell 120,000. You see the second book sell, sort of 50, 60, and so on. The ratio applies wherever your starting point is.
So that's a really, really good insight for publishers, definitely. And thinking about the last few years, and we've had Brexit here in the UK. What kind of motivations did people want to? What was driving them to buy what kind of book in a time of Brexit?
Well, I think, as I think I said, I think that the way I look at books when they work in a really big way. It's rather like antidotes or solutions to problems. What does not work typically is when you mirror back a problem to a reader and a consumer. And I think if you then ask the question, well, what is the problem right now? What is the lack? What is the ailment that a market has at any given point in time? Then you can start asking, well, what might be the suitable antidote to that? So during Brexit, I think you saw a number of things happen. The wave of humour. There was that brilliant Enid Blyton parody, Five Go Mad on Brexit Island, or whatever it was called. In a period where everyone's feeling intensely frustrated at the absurdity of it all, out of control, humour. It allows you to let off steam. I think in a period of uncertainty, books which offer a sense of really concrete certainty will do well. So I think you saw, I think, a bit of an upsurge in serious non-fiction, partly as a response to that. There were a number of books like the Jordan Peterson and Sapiens and the Matthew Walker Why We Sleep, which really took off during that period. One of the things I found absolutely fascinating was memoir. Now, for a long time, I think most within the industry had talked endlessly about the death of celebrity autobiographies, in the knowledge that back in 2008 there was a peak. You had a huge volume selling. There were, I think, something like 21 memoirs that year that sold over 100,000 copies. That was on decline. And during the 2010s, there were a couple of years where maybe 3 to 4 books, not all celebrity, in any case, but only 3 to 4 books might sell over 100,000 copies. What you started seeing in 2017 was that number go up. I think first it went to 6, and then in 2018 it went to 9, and then in 2019 you saw 17 memoirs sell over 100,000 copies. Now, I think that's absolutely staggering and so interesting because firstly, it contradicts any assumption that what you were seeing back in 2008 was purely to do with the retail landscape, that supermarkets were taking a lot of books. Yes, they were, but I don't think that's the full picture. What I take away from that is thinking how in a period of great uncertainty about how the hell do you live your life, a memoir is something that we naturally navigate towards, because I look at how someone else has lived, how they've navigated through grief, dealt with their mortality, gained success. I look to see how someone else has lived in order to understand how I can live. And I think what you saw in 2008, 2009 was, of course, was a financial crash, a period where a lot of people might have quite reasonably asking that question. I think you again saw the same thing, in the wake of Brexit. The question, how do I live my life right now? And a memoir is a vehicle for carrying some lessons around that. So that was one of the most interesting, I think, sort of big explosions of book sales during the Brexit period.
And of course, now we're talking in a time of Corona, and I know you've been trying to study the market at the moment as well to see, can you pick up any Corona trends in the book market?
I hope so. I think so. Yeah, no, I do actually. I know one thing that you can say straight away is that because the retail landscape has been completely upended, you've seen the closure of high street shops, and you've seen the growth of online sales in a really dramatic way. What that enables you to do is to look at Amazon around various countries, and I think see it as being a very realistic barometer of people's urgent, immediate motivations for buying books. So I think it's been a really fascinating period for anyone who's interested in trying to look at what people are really motivated by in their book purchases. I've been doing a lot of looking at what's been selling internationally, and talking to colleagues that I know in other countries, and it's been fascinating to see how you've seen trends that really are international. So as a snapshot, I think in late April I was looking, and Albert Camus' The Plague was everywhere actually, apart from in the UK. And I don't know whether that's because of some embarrassing Francophobia or dislike of existential philosophers, but every other country you looked at, and it was the second best-selling book in Japan at one point. That came amidst what a Polish friend of mine described as plague literature, almost as though people were turning to narratives, fictional narratives, mostly in the past, set in the past, but sometimes dystopian ones in the future, to try and make sense of what was going on right now. And I think that's a key thing to pick up from it, is that if the present feels profoundly unsafe, where do you look for safety and for certainty? Where do you go for your escapism? You can't escape into the present. So the past offers escapism. You can also look to the future for a more dystopian view, and it's interesting to see the Peter May lockdown book doing so well recently. You know, it's I think that's symptomatic of people thinking, well, how might this go? You know, even if it's dystopian, it sort of is offering you some semblance of certainty about how things might pan out in an uncertain world, and that's something which I think that historical angle is something we've seen before. One reason why I think there will be one or two really big history books in the next couple of years is because in the wake of the First and Second World Wars, that's exactly what you saw. You had H.G. Wells's Outline of History in 1919. You had in the US, there's a book called The American Past. I can't remember the author. I think in 1945 or slightly after. It's almost as though if you, as a market, as a population, you're going through something in the present that's just so significant and unsettling, there's a requirement almost to take the long view, to put it into perspective. You can retreat into the past for safety, for nostalgia, for escapism, but it also offers you a way just to put the present into some form of perspective. So that's something we're going to see more of, I think, and already are seeing. I think also... Sorry, I mean, I've got a lot of thoughts on this, so you'll have to shut me up if I go on a bit too much. I mean, early on, you saw something really noticeable just in terms of immediate motivations, which was people buying books for their children, educational books, entertainment books. You know, in April, I think something like 2/3 of the Amazon Top 100 was taken up with books for kids. As I think parents were thinking, how do I achieve a sense of competence as a parent right now? I can't send them to school. I need to do this in a different way. I think that's given over quite a lot recently towards more entertainment. And I think a lot of the children's educational books have been overtaken by storybooks. Perhaps as parents have become a little bit more desperate to offer some amusement as opposed to education. Other themes you've seen, anything offering people a sense of financial health or spiritual resilience and self-sufficiency. And a stunning thing that I think is to see internationally is the revival of a couple of backlist books. One of them, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, which I think must be about 15, 20 years old. And another one right from 1937, Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich. You know, published in the same year as Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. So, you know, both those books being, something which emerged from the Great Depression. They've just kind of shot up in almost every country I've looked at and I think it's people thinking, well, I don't trust my company to look after me. I don't really feel I can trust the government right now. The only way I'm going to be safe is if I take my financial self-sufficiency and resilience into my own hands. And I think, again, that's something we're going to see more of. Sorry, there's lots of thoughts here.
You were giving examples of books that seem to be doing well in the Corona times.
Yeah, as I say, I mean that has definitely evolved. I think you've seen certain areas wax and wane. One thing that I think again has been fascinating just in the last couple of weeks is the market has once again completely transformed. In the wake of the George Floyd protests, you've seen the market's complexion really alter. And I have to say, it's in most countries I've looked, it's not had as much an impact anywhere as much as it has done in the UK and the US, a little bit in Germany, but looking last week, I think half of the books in the Amazon top 100 in the States had as a theme or topic race, and half of those books were aimed at children, which I thought was fascinating. That you have a huge number of parents thinking, how can I educate my children right now in what's going on? And again, you've seen something happening here to a lesser extent, and I think to bring it back to some of the thoughts that I've got about motivations, I think there's a very urgent, compelling need for people to learn right now. There's a utilitarian motivation. I want to learn about these issues and educate myself. I think there's also a very strong self-identificatory one, as people are buying books because they want to feel that they are supporting the protests. So again, you've got these really powerful motivations, and just in the space of a couple of weeks, the market's changed. The last thing I'd say is, sort of in terms of what we're going to see over the next couple of years, and this could be a fatal thing to talk about as I demonstrate that I'm completely wrong about all of this, Angus. I do think that you are going to see more books which take that longer view. I wouldn't be surprised if you see a sweeping historical epic emerge. I think one thing I've been thinking about is whether there might be scope for a real bodice-ripping yarn, a la a book called Forever Amber that was published in 1943. Yeah. And without wanting to be too prurient about this, I think that a depleted need that a lot of people have right now is for physical contact with other people. As well as that long view, I think it wouldn't be surprising if you get some kind of sweeping historical epic that's quite raunchy, doing well. I could be completely wrong about that. Books that help us make sense by applying that historical angle. I think there will be a bit more dystopian stuff. I also think that as people become more contracted within their bubbles, I wouldn't actually be surprised if a certain amount of paranoia sets in, and you might see a bit of a wave of books that tap into a sort of conspiracy theory approach, the kind of stuff like the Graham Hancock stuff that we saw some 25 years ago. And I think actually, just in terms of fiction, we have seen a bit of that recently. I mean, some of the books that have been doing very well in terms of contemporary fiction, you've had things like the Family Upstairs, The Couple Next Door. Yeah. There's a sort of growing sense of slight social paranoia. And sadly, I don't think that's going to go away very soon. I do think the whole thing about resilience will carry on. I think, without wanting to be too depressing, if we're on the verge of a serious financial recession, one thing I'd be very surprised if we don't see is a resurgence of nostalgia in some form or another. And again, it's that long view, but I think that typically in periods of recession, you do see a boom in nostalgia publishing. And I think we don't look back to our parents' generation often for the answers. We kind of grew up with them. We know what they think. We don't look back 3 generations ago because it's too far ago to really sort of have much purchase on what we're going through. We tend to look back around 50 to 60 years to say our 2 generations ago. So, you could say that in the 70s, people were looking back to the late Edwardian period. In the financial crash, people were looking back to the 50s. I think that there'll probably be a number of books based in the 60s and 70s, books that offer a sense of uplift, but that sort of, I don't know. I mean, I was thinking about a book like A Kestrel for a Knave, or Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. Yeah. I think there will be a few books like that, memoirs perhaps as well as fiction, that we start seeing as people again look to the past for answers about the present and the future.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. I mean, it's a good note to finish on with your predictions for the future, and we can re-examine them in a little while to see how well you've done.
Dangerous and probably a bit stupid.
Yeah, but I do encourage you to read Dan's article. It's coming out in my journal, Logos, fairly soon, and I'll post on the website the link once we've got that article ready. But thank you so much, Dan, for sparing the time and for your fascinating thoughts around motivations, and your article pursues some of those threads in more detail. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.